All right, and this will be recorded because we're going to post it on the Center for Research and Creativity website later on. All right. Cool.
I use Keynote, so PowerPoint's always new to me.
You got it.
All right, okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Britton, and I am a graduating senior pursuing a degree in graphic design. Today, I will be speaking to you about ethical design in the age of consumerism. Okay, this is a research project I took on to finish out my journey with the honors program. The class requires us to take what we have learned throughout the honors program and apply those lessons to our major. During my research phase, I read theory from new philosophers and also referred to the philosophers I had read in the past. Initially, I was striving to answer the question, why is ethical design important? But I was answering that question from a designer's standpoint and primarily my own. I then began to question, why should we care about ethical design? But my research led me around in a circle as I kept getting caught up on the good. There are many variations of what the good is, and the problem is that many of them are in competition with one another. Even as I present the research I have today, I must say that much of it is flawed and unfinished. I'm still exploring this topic for my class, but I wish to present to you today the information I have gathered thus far. Okay. The question I finally settled upon answering is, what impact has mass consumerism had on design? And why is it important for us as consumers to be aware of this impact? I'll be using terms such as good, ethical, and unethical. In the design world, good design is separate from ethics. It is based on functionality and or aesthetic appeal. And whether a design is ethical or unethical can be subjective. So as I'm using these terms, please be aware that I'm using them from the point of view of a designer. Graphic design is at its core visual communication. Graphic designers create for many different reasons, but every designer approaches each project with the same two questions in mind. What is the problem and what is the best solution? This approach applies to anything. That includes logos for small startups, rebranding for large corporations, poster designs for campaigns, packaging for face wash, the list is endless. Something as simple as a swoosh is easily identifiable by most of us because of graphic design. This logo is everywhere. Nike makes it a point to put it on every one of their products. It is simple, it is effective, it is impactful. It is an example of good design. But there comes a point when good design becomes too effective, and that is when it feeds into mass consumerism culture. So now that we have briefly covered what makes good design, ethical design is something that we have to kind of talk about separately. It's separated into a category of its own. Now, ethical design can be good design, but so can unethical design. Without showcasing any specific examples, here is a simple chart that breaks down what is considered ethical design. Ethical design doesn't always have to be campaigning a cause or righting the wrongs of the world, but what it does have to do is respect human experience, effort, and rights. Since ethics are shaped by the culture surrounding you and the place you live in, we will all have some differing ideas on what we deem ethical and unethical. So I'm not going to try to persuade or inform you of my thoughts on ethical design. What I will do, though, is help you identify where your morals lie and how you can become aware of the agenda being pushed onto you by graphic design. Mass consumerism is the usage of goods and service by a large number of people. In many cases, this economic phenomenon is viewed as a positive, and I agree that it is. The occurrence of mass consumerism in our society reflects that people's basic needs have been met. This allows for the overconsumption of goods past the point of any real necessity. But that is exactly where the problem lies. We have been taught that consuming beyond our needs is natural. Celebrities and the influence of social media icons make us think that if we eat what they eat, drink what they drink, buy what they buy, essentially mimic what we see in the photos, we will have their lives. We will one day reach their status and live the lives they project for all of their viewers to see, simply by spending money on the products they promote. And it isn't just celebrities pushing the agenda. Companies do it all the time. They rely on us as consumers to really push a product. Apple releases multiple products in a year, the next always promising to be better than the last, with cool new features you never knew you needed until you got your hands on it. This is just one example of planned obsolescence. What was once the hottest product on the market no longer holds any real value. We don't realize how this impacts our lives because for many of us, this is our lives. So what does this have to do with graphic design? And to that question, I say everything. Without graphic design, these companies and celebrities would be trying to sell these products with zero visuals. They would be trying to convince you through their words and actions that these products truly work. They would have to take the time and effort to persuade you, and you as a consumer would have more time to mull things over before making a decision. But due to graphic design, a person is constantly viewing ads for a number of products and services every single day. We are surrounded by reproductions. This is a phenomenon first described by philosopher Walter Benjamin in his essay Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Traditional art for Benjamin has lost its aura. A copy of an artwork does not have the same impact as the original because it has been removed from its private space and is now on display for all of the world to see. The experience of viewing the work where it belongs is lost. In the case of graphic design, nothing has an aura because it is meant to be viewed by everyone. We shop in the hopes of achieving something, but in reality, we are searching for an aura that is unattainable. And that brings me to my next point. During my research, I was introduced to many profound readings, but none more so than Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard, written in 1981. In his philosophical treatise, Baudrillard examines the relationship between symbols or simulacra and the simulation we have put ourselves in because of them. Baudrillard claims that symbols can be used to represent, misrepresent, stand in for, or completely replace reality. Where we are in the world today would be the latter. This is what Baudrillard would call hyperreality. It has surpassed what is actually real. We are no longer individuals with meaning, but individuals who try to give their lives meaning by purchasing things that they believe represent some larger meaning. Another reading that aided my research would be John Berger's The Ways of Seeing, which was greatly inspired by Benjamin. In this book, Berger discusses the power of imagery and how art has been used throughout history as a status symbol. But instead of us owning original oil paintings to show off our wealth, we purchase items to represent a wealth we want but don't necessarily have. We are not aristocrats with money to splurge on at will, but we want to believe we are. As Berger says, publicity is the culture of the consumer society. And a fun fact about the image shown here, this ad series for Gucci was banned in China for promoting an unrealistic high-end lifestyle to create a bad social ethos. The next bit of information I would like to share with you all today is from another reading entitled Mythologies by Roland Barthes. It is a collection of essays that involve how our social value as a society creates new modern day myths. What we deem important as a society shapes how we interact with the world around us. So what we believe to be fact is nothing more than a social construct in most cases. These myths apply to how we talk to people, how we dress, what we eat, literally every decision we make throughout the day. But what is important to know about these myths is that they are pushed upon us by the bourgeoisie. If we keep believing in these myths, then society will continue to function in a way that benefits the masses. When applying this concept to graphic design and its impact on consumerism, we see our lives are dictated by the myth that we can build our identities by what we buy. It's almost like manifestation. There's a saying, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. And people do just that with their lives. Dress your life up the way you want to live, not the way you're living now. It all becomes a facade before you know it. And that dream job and dream life will never come into manifestation because you have zero means to obtain it. Now I could go on and on about how this way of living has caused the gap between the rich and poor to increase, but I have a time limit. What is important to realize is that we shape the myth of our society. Nothing is set in stone. If you have the money to purchase a brand new Tesla because you want to, then that is perfectly fine. But what you shouldn't do is buy a brand new Tesla when you don't have the money because you think it will impress the ones around you and in turn make your life better. And that leads me to my next point. We live in such a fast-paced world. We are used to getting our information quick and easy, and then we move on with our day. But in those few seconds it takes for you to scroll past a picture on Instagram or glance at a poster on the wall at the mall, you are absorbing information. That imagery is shaping you in a way that you don't even notice. And I'm not saying we're all gullible and will buy anything presented to us on a silver platter. Graphic designers strategically make things enticing, so it is ultimately up to us to stay informed. Here's a box of cereal. Many of you may have enjoyed this brand of cereal from time to time. There are commercials and advertisements of the mascot, Tony the Tiger, interacting with young children. The kids are usually playing some sort of sport or being physically active. The colors on the packaging are bright and energetic, and the text looks like it is ready to fly off the box. Everything about this looks safe and even good for kids. But in reality, the cereal is high in sugar and salt and low in fiber. It does nothing positive for a child's health, not to mention an adult's. With the amount of sugar in the cereal combined with a cup of milk, That is already half the amount of sugar eating 2,000 calories, a person eating 2,000 calories a day should consume. And that's from one meal alone. That's only if you follow the nutrition facts, which are blandly laid out, almost begging you not to read them. So what does this all mean? Should society riot against big business and require only ethical design be produced? Do we want the truth always staring us dead in the face? Can we handle the truth? Some companies have actually turned to this method. People have begun to pay more attention to what they consume, and businesses have taken notice. Companies have turned to more ethical ways of production, toting fair trade and cruelty-free on their packaging. But there are just some products that cannot change no matter how hard they try to rebrand. A regular Coke, no matter how many times the packaging may change, will always be a carbonated drink full of sugar. And it is up to us as the consumer to decide if drinking that can of sugar is worth it or not. As a graphic designer, it almost hurts to tell you that you shouldn't be fooled by the pretty pictures. I always considered my career path one that helps people, that informs the misinformed and the uninformed. But in reality, the space graphic design occupies today is eating away at our livelihoods. So I just want to ask all of you today to question, what do you find worth it? Is purchasing that $5 coffee with a green logo on the cup every day worth it? Is wearing a $60 hoodie with a check mark on it worth it? How about spending hours upon hours scrolling through picture after picture of people living their lives in places you want to go to? Is that worth it to you? If it is, that's just fine. And if it isn't, then what is worth it to you? I will leave you here today with a quote that my professor, Dr. Walsh, shared with me, and I think it sums everything up perfectly. This quote is by Italian journalist Calvino. "The inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here. The inferno where we live every day that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape the suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not inferno, then make them endure, give them peace." Thank you.
All right, thank you, Karen. That was great. All right. Let me pull up, or actually, Kesimy, yeah, you don't have, yeah. So let me just eject out of this. And then, okay. All right, should be good to go.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kesimy Martinez. I am a senior here at Methodist University and a social work major. My presentation today is about the Common Core standard. In the United States, 41 states and the District of Columbia, 4 territories, and the Department of Defense Education Activity have voluntarily adopted the Common Core State Standard Initiative. The Common Core State Standard Initiative informational website states, the Common Core focuses on developing the critical thinking, problem solving, and analytical skills. Developers of the standard claim students participating in the Common Core will be well preconditioned to collaborate and compete with peers within the United States and internationally. The Common Core establishes standards for only the subjects of mathematics and English language arts. Though there are organizations making efforts towards establishing national standards for science, world language arts, and the arts, there is no initiative towards teaching students personal attributes that allow them to work with people of diverse cultures and backgrounds effectively and comfortably. Soft skills such as attitudes of inclusion and diversity awareness are not recognized as necessary for students to be taught within the Common Core standards for participating school curriculums. Though Common Core standards address reading levels and skills students should meet, the standard does not address the type of material students should be reading, the types of messages in these books, or how to include anti-discriminatory practices in lesson plans. The Common Core standards should modify their English language arts skill standards to include curriculum material guidelines that teach students about inclusivity and diversity awareness. Research conducted by Andrew Barron and Mazarine Banaji concluded that six-year-olds have already developed implicit pro-white and anti-Black associations. Elementary school student elementary school children ages range from 5 to 10 years. By the age children are required to attend elementary school, they have already crystallized biases molded and shaped by a variety of means, including their interactions and experience in preparatory schools and daycare facilities. Students spend 1,000 of 6,000 hours in a year at school, where their preconceptions are reinforced by their peers, teachers, and course content. Developers of Common Core standards should consider the impact the standards have on how courses of studies are prepared and optimize the standards from simply addressing reading and reading comprehension skills to including curriculum content that encourages teachers to plan lessons promoting attitudes of inclusivity and diversity awareness. The United States is a part of a growing global economy in which businesses are expanding their engagements with people of diverse cultural backgrounds. People no longer live and work in an insular environment. They are now a part of a worldwide economy competing with a global framework. The diversity experienced within the United States now only accounts for a fraction of the diversity around the world. Students with attitudes of inclusivity and awareness of the importance of diversity are better able to communicate and interact with communities and concepts that they are unfamiliar with. This enhances their social development and understanding of the world, thus better preparing them to be a part of a global society. Teaching students the value of diversity and how to better accept their peers or people of different backgrounds than their own makes them more competitive and is quickly becoming a requirement for success after graduation and when entering the workforce. America is known as a melting pot, as it is home to a variety of cultures and backgrounds, largely in part by immigration. Students learning to be more understanding and accepting of a variety of cultures and lifestyles will help them make better informed decisions when voting and participating in other political activities regarding the lives and sustainment of people of diverse backgrounds who live or want to live in the United States. Though it may be argued that children attending elementary schools are too young to vote, a child is never too young to learn that not all Hispanics are Mexicans, and that Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States. Once students are able to work with a diversity of backgrounds and cultures, they will be able to accept new ideas and accept that these differences are valuable for their personal and professional lives. Whether subliminal or obvious, books influence how students view themselves and the world around them. Educators fill their personal classroom book collections with literary classics and books they believe will encourage students to read. Public schools collect books for a variety of reading levels and encourage students to check out these books. All collections of books in a public school should combat negative biases and reinforce messages of inclusivity. Rudine Sims Bishop, in her article, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Doors, states, when children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when images seem to be distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society in which they are a part. It is important to include literature about all communities, especially those that are generally underrepresented in society and representative in negative stereotypes. When children reading books about them will bolster negative stereotypes, or they can weaken negative beliefs. The Common Core standards should add regulations that ensure teachers actively seek out books involving diverse characters instead of sticking to classic books that may fortify biases. Dr. Seuss, a household name and staple in elementary school education, has been exposed for including anti-Black, Orientalism, and white supremacy in his children's book, Images and Stories. The cat is out of the bag. Orientalism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy in Dr. Seuss children's books states 98% of the human characters in Dr. Seuss children's books are white, and the books are solely narrated by white characters. In addition, white characters are always in a dominant relational role to characters of color, with characters of color driving, entertaining, or working for them. Some of the books in the collection of Dr. Seuss classic books are harmful to children of all backgrounds by supporting white supremacy and degrading characters of color. Katie Izuska and Ramon Stevens share, when children's books censor whiteness, erase people of color and other oppressed groups, or represent people of color in a stereotypical or dehumanizing or subordinate ways, they both ingrain and reinforce internalized racism and white supremacy. Messages of discrimination are delivered through images, storylines, and characters. It is important that instructors are driven to weed out literature that moves children to believe they are not important to society. Books that promote diversity are becoming more popular and accessible to educators. By ensuring there are books available to students that represent a variety of cultures, school systems empower students and enlighten those who have never encountered people from different cultures. Rudine Sims Bishop states, books may be one of the few places where children who are socially isolated and insulated from the larger world may meet people unlike themselves. Books that accurately and positively introduce students to new communities of people allow pupils to experience a new type of empathy, identifying with communities of people they may have known little or nothing about before. Students who live in communities with a majority of one culture may become aware that there is more to the world than the small pocket they have experienced. Bishop calls this a window, a book that reveals the variations of the world, such as language, history, traditions, and other topics specific to cultural groups outside one's student experiences on their day-to-day life. Just as easily as images, storylines, and characters can express destructive images, they can be constructive. Stories may function as mirrors. When children find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images are seen are realistic, positive, or honorable, they may learn a powerful lesson about how they are valued in the society of which they are part. Students that can identify with a character that is successful are more inclined to believe they can also be successful. The Common Core State Standard Initiative intends to give students across America a fair opportunity to reach their full potential. Developers claim that any student that proficiently meets the Common Core standards provided for English, language arts, and math skills will be groomed for college or any entry-level job upon high school graduation. This claim is false, as American businesses are becoming increasingly involved in global trade and America continues to welcome immigrants from across the globe. Students that are not taught lessons in inclusivity and diversity awareness may never learn to effectively and comfortably work with people of diverse backgrounds, thus putting them at a disadvantage. The Common Core standards does not fulfill the mission of ensuring students' preparedness, as it does not currently prepare students for working in the global economy. To make the standards more effective, the Common Core State Standard Initiative should modify standards to include curriculum guidelines for the English language arts curriculum to include course materials that introduce diversity and move pupils to attitudes of inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kesemy. That was awesome. All right. Plenty of questions already in my mind. But let's, like I said, let's save them until the end. Let's hear Maria's presentation. Let me pull up your let me just screen share here. Oops. And okay. There you go. All right, and Maria is next.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here over Zoom. My name is Maria Choi, and I'm presenting my honors senior project titled Science Systems in Literature, Struggles for Power and Identity in Story. And really, this entire project has been focused on the question of our responsibility as readers when we're engaging with literature and stories. And I know it kind of seems like it could be a basic question because, of course, we need to be careful about what we're reading and thinking critically about it. But as I discovered through my research and readings, there are so many levels to how stories can be giving and taking power that this is a really important question to go in depth with. And because also this is not just for stories that are part of the literary canon or are considered revolutionary or dangerous, but also the stories that we're just reading for fun on our own, for entertainment, which means that as readers, we need to be dedicated to being responsible with everything we read to include, and perhaps especially with those works that we view as innocent. And I've organized my project into 6 different sections of how stories are connected with the struggle for power and identity. So I'm just going to move through those 6 sections and then finish off with kind of what our response can be. So my first section is language and power, how what is said and unsaid can naturalize myths. Because at the foundational level of a book, it's going to be written in a language. You can't get away from that. And I'm focusing on the English language and literature and stories in English. So we cannot escape the language of a book, but the very language itself, not even looking at the content or the themes or the plot yet of a story, the language can be building myths and social narratives in a work, building social narratives for a society and how people function within it. And so Roland Barthes' mythologies was a huge contributing factor for this section, and Karen talked about it in her presentation. And he lays out in his work how language works according to sign systems. So basically, the words that we use have an arbitrary connection with their meaning. There's no real connection besides just the meaning that we've assigned to the words. For example, the word rose doesn't have actually anything to do with a real rose, but it's the link, it's a placeholder and a sign of our idea of a rose and then what a rose is. And that's the linguistic system of language. But the linguistic system of language can turn into a mythological system. So it takes what a word means and what a sign signifies, and then turns that meaning or signification into another sign for something else. It's a bit confusing, but an example that might help that you might be familiar with is Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, in which she talks about how language views men as the primary sex because the term mankind, for example, is used to mean both men and women. So men become the primary or they become both the positive and the neuter, while women are the negative. And that's an example of how ideas about how society is structured can be embedded and naturalized within the language we use. Another example that will help kind of show the differences in these levels is the sentence, "He gave her a rose." On the linguistic system, you have the basic meaning that might be the man gave the woman a flower. And that's just, okay, we take what the words mean. But there's also different levels there in the sentence. You could look at the symbolic system, in which we know that a rose is often used as a symbol for love and romance. So the meaning of the sentence becomes, the man gave the woman a symbol of his love. But then you can also move to the mythological system, in which you can look at how this simple sentence might be pushing assumptions about the roles that men and women have in romantic relationships, the way that men are often assumed to be the active pursuer, the subject of the sentence, and women are often assumed to be the passive receivers, the indirect object of the sentence. So then that simple sentence becomes an example of how language can be used to give power to certain groups in society and to place certain groups over other groups in society. But then also, that's talking about how what is said in books can be giving power. Also, what is unsaid can be giving power. And this, I was reading a book by Ariel Dorfman called The Empire's Old Clothes. And basically, he's looking at how even the most innocent stories for children, bedtime stories and comics, can be saturated with social myths about how identity works within a structure of power. And he uses the example of a Donald Duck comic. In the comic, Donald's uncle is supposed to be very wealthy. He has a lot of wealth, but the story doesn't talk at all about where Donald's uncle got this wealth. It doesn't talk about the process of how it was accumulated or of the other people who were involved in gaining that wealth. And so in this particular story, the wealth belongs to Donald's uncle because that's the way things are. And all of his workers are happy with their unspecified but undoubtedly small income because that's the way things are. And so this story for children, by not explaining the history of this wealth, by leaving that unsaid and unspoken, the comic presents these underlying assumptions of who deserves to be rich, about how much money a person should or can have, about what type of characters are in which socioeconomic positions. And it makes this situation appear natural because they don't go into the history of how it came to be. There's no questioning it. It's just, this is the way things are. And obviously, in a certain story, not all of this information could be given just because stories are limited by space and time. But because stories can't say everything, and because authors need to be making choices about what they are saying, then what is not said, what is being left out, in addition to what is said, becomes a potentially politically and mythologically rich story, one which might be naturalizing a certain idea of how society works and an idea that might be giving power to one group over another group. And perhaps these things kind of seem small and maybe they don't matter too much just as we're reading books, but Roland Barthes makes a really interesting suggestion that if we're not being negatively affected by a myth, whether we recognize it as a myth or not, it's because we're the ones on the receiving end of the power structure. And he says, we hold this myth to be politically insignificant only because it is not meant for us. So it brings up the question, if something seems normal to us, is it possibly because we are on the receiving end of a social myth? Then my next section is stories and power, how books represent economic and social and cultural positions. So this is about how a story, a work of literature, is a product of and a sign of a certain economic, social, and cultural position. This is considering who is in a position to write the books that we are reading. The people who are telling the stories, where do they come from within society, and what beliefs and perceptions about the world will they hold as a result of that position? Virginia Woolf, in her room, in a book or a room of one's own, she talks about how Shakespeare, if he had had an equally talented sister who really wanted to write as well, the Shakespeare sister would never have been able to reach the level Shakespeare did because of the limitations put on her during that time. So it's an example of how the production of a book is not a viable option for everyone, which means we must recognize that the stories we read are told by voices who are in a position to be heard. And then there's the question whose voices are not being heard and what stories are not being told. There's also a slightly different angle to look at this question of how books are signs of social power. And this has to do with how literature and cultural taste and socioeconomic status are very integrated, to the point that someone's taste for art can often be determined by their social position. Pierre Bourdieu is the author of Distinction, a social critique on the judgment of taste. And he analyzes how someone's education and exposure to art can create these distinctions between social classes that make it really difficult to move fully up the social ladder because your cultural tastes will give you away. And this has to do with the fact that literature and art is an ongoing conversation and very intertextual. So to appreciate this work over here, you kind of need to be familiar with this work over here. I think T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, is a great example of this kind of elitist tendency of literature. His poem, The Wasteland, has so many allusions and references in it that you have to be really well culturally educated to kind of get it all and to appreciate it. But to be culturally educated, you have to be in a position where you have those resources and opportunities to be exposed to those works. And of course, today we have Google, which helps a lot with the references. And additionally, the elitism of artistic taste has decreased quite a bit with postmodernism and post-structuralism, which has moved away from that gap between high and low or high and popular culture. But you can kind of still see the superiority that might tend to be given to people who read the classics, for example, over those who read contemporary literary fiction. So then works of literature and even someone's literary taste can become a sign of social status and power because someone's exposure to certain works is often a sign of their position in the social hierarchy. Then my third section is literature and power, how Western literature can reflect and support imperialism and nationalistic superiority. And so English literature as a discipline and as a whole has a long history of being used as a sign of national power and imperialism and colonialism. In his book, Culture and Imperialism by Edward Said, Said analyzes how English literature across the centuries has helped to give Western civilization a sense of superiority over other nations and the sense that they have a right to be in control because of how they view themselves as the pinnacle of civilization and progress. And because most people during those times would not travel to other nations and they would never actually meet these other people, then the literature they read would tell them what to think about these people. It would create an identity for the other cultures. It would create a reality for the Westerners, a reality that naturalized imperialism. And this didn't need to be literature that was even explicitly about other cultures. One of Said's examples of how English literature helped to normalize imperialism is Jane Austen's book, Mansfield Park, in which the main character, Fanny, her uncle owns a plantation in Antigua. And it's mentioned just kind of in passing. The very fact that her uncle owns a slave plantation and it's not questioned, it's not explained, it's not addressed, it just shows how normal it was. And so in literature and stories, it becomes a cycle. People view something as normal because it's presented as normal in the stories they're reading, and then it continues to be presented as normal in the stories they're reading because people view it as natural. And this is still happening today in different forms and ways, both in physical books, but also in the media, which is helping to continue to support certain narratives and myths about globalization and America's role in the world. My fourth section is looking at identity and power and how the connection between self and other can cause struggles for superiority. And this is the idea that we don't actually have identity as an individual except in relation to other. And so because of that, the relationship between self and other almost always includes that struggle for power. Martin Buber talks about two primary words that give us identity, and he labels them the I, it, and the I, thou. And in both these words, the I, the self, is tied together with something else, either the it or the thou. So this is never just me, it's always me in relation to something else. And both these primary words are necessary for existence, but a lot of times we tend to just live in the I-it relationship, which views others as objects to be experienced and used by ourselves. And what is necessary to try to attempt to move towards is the I-thou relationship, which views other people as their own subjects as well. So we recognize, okay, I'm my own person with my own experience and experience of reality, but you're also your own person with your experience of reality. And we're not just objects to be used by each other, but we're each our own subjects. And so this recognizes, in a way, everyone's shared humanity, and it's a connection. It's a more spiritual relationship that's based on connection, while the I-it relationship is based on differentiation. And this relationship becomes really important for stories because stories are about identity. They're about who humans are, why we're here, what we're doing. But if the identity of self is so interconnected with identity of other, and if we tend to fall into that I-it relationship, viewing others as objects, then people can feel like their validity in themselves, in their own identity, is being threatened when they are faced with someone different with different beliefs and different perspectives. And that's where stories move into empowering some and disempowering others, because the tension in the relationship between self and other can turn into comparison and a struggle for inferiority versus superiority. And this leads right into my fifth section, which is interpretation and power, how our interpretation of the stories we're reading can construct the identity of self and other. Because if people are always finding, if they're always in tension of finding identity between self and other, then books are being written and read from that perspective of that struggle for power and identity, which means that our personal interpretation of a story is determined by what we've already read, what we've already been told and accepted is true about ourselves and about people. And then when we engage with a new text, our interpretation is very likely going to be benefiting ourselves. Borges' collection of short stories, Ficciones, presents ideas of how the lines between reality and what we read are very, very blurred. So what you read becomes a part of you. You can't separate that anymore. And Michel Foucault in History of Sexuality talks about how knowledge is never unpolitical or innocent. It's always going to empower some and disempower someone else. So we can bring unintentional agendas to what we read. And if we're not careful, our interpretation can tend to benefit ourselves and those like us rather than those we see as different and as other. In which case, not only might we be reading a work that is a product of someone who comes from a position of power already, who might be trying to, who's even unintentionally still giving power to the dominant in society, but we might also be bringing our own agendas to the text, trying to validify our identity by interpreting the stories in a way that benefits and empowers us, regardless of what the author originally intended or how our interpretation is affecting others. My last section is signs and power, how identity of self and other can lose value. And this bit of my project is recognizing that signs can begin to have value attributed to them as a sign rather than value be given to the meaning of the sign, what the sign is supposed to signify. Because if we go back to the mythological system of language in which words can be used as myths, also concepts and just general things can be used as myths that become signs for something else. So this sign here becomes a sign for another sign, which is a sign for another sign. And instead of getting to the actual core meaning and signification and value, you're just lost in all of these signs moving through reality. And that, I know this is a bit confusing, but what's important for this is that in the relationship between self and other, the celebration and value of diversity and the differences of other can become lost in the signs, and the value can be given to the sign of diversity rather than to the individual who has the diversity. It's like when you see businesses saying, we value diversity, but all of the people in power look the same and come from the same cultural and socioeconomic background. So there's a difference between valuing self and other as a sign of something else and valuing self and other for themselves. And that's the same way that we can maybe recognize some of these sign systems in stories and literature. And then there's a difference between also responding to that. And so that's why I'd like to move to just this last section of looking at our response. Why do we as individuals have a responsibility to recognize and respond to these social narratives and power struggles in language and story? And the answer to this question goes back to how interconnected our identity is with the identity of other and with community. Because we are social creatures. We are connected to other people in our identity. And so if you look back through some of the bigger names in philosophy, you see their continued emphasis on social responsibility. For Aristotle, a fulfilling life had to include social responsibility. For Confucius, his 5 sacred relationships are about an individual's role to others and to society. John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism combines individual liberty with social utility. Kant's categorical imperatives determine a moral action by how that action relates to and impacts other people. So we do have a responsibility as social individuals to be aware of any injustices and inequality in society. And literature as a discipline and as individual stories that we're reading is able to establish myths and to give and take power through the language itself, through books as a sign of social power, through books as a sign of national power, through the intertextual experience and interpretation of the author and reader. And as a result, as readers, we need to be aware that the stories we're reading for school, yes, but also just for fun, these books can be giving and taking power, and so helping to further oppression of certain individuals, social classes, societies, cultures, nations. And in conclusion, then reading is not an innocent activity. And when we engage with a text, we need to be willing to consider what myths about our identity and the identity of others that we might have been accepting as natural that are actually disempowering others. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And so, okay, Maria mentioned Scrooge McDuck, so I'm not gonna, well, you didn't mention him, you called him Donald's uncle, but Scrooge McDuck, of course, comes from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. He's sort of adapted from that. And yeah, I think that also gives us some insight in terms of, okay, if he's adapted from that character, yeah, the way that he's making money is by squeezing and clenching money out of other people and being a miser. So yeah, it's interesting the different sort of levels of myth that we can get to. I had a feeling this would be a good panel. I thought there were some interesting connections between the abstracts I received, and there definitely were for the presentation. So any questions for any of our panelists? You can put it in the chat. You can just unmute and ask. Don't be shy. Well, I'll start off then, because I have plenty. So, okay. Let's start with, we'll go in order. I want to hear from Karen. That was a great presentation. I want you to, you can address this as little or as much as you want. You talked about good and ethical in terms of obviously design, but what was hovering all over what you were saying is that concept of capitalism. So is capitalism good? Is capitalism ethical in terms of the way you were studying design? And come on up here so they can hear you.
All right. So in terms of graphic design, I would say yes, capitalism is good. I wouldn't say it is the good, and it's not necessarily ethical, but it can be because it's supposed to benefit the masses. Is basically, if we have capitalism, then it's for the greater good, essentially. So that's the problem with graphic design, is that it assumes who the masses are, and so then it doesn't mean to, but it excludes groups of people, and so then it excludes people of like different social economic statuses and different races. So yeah, I mean, capitalism can be good, but I feel like we just need to be aware of it. Does that make sense?
Great. Got a question in the chat. Let's see. Okay, Jennifer has a question. Dr. Roar Walsh has a question for Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Hello.
I really enjoyed it. I wanted to know, and not to put you on the spot, but how receptive do you think the graphic design community is to this concern for ethics? Even could you talk about what you're learning in classes? Is this controversial for what you're learning in classes, or what you think the profession is going to be like?
So initially, a lot of my readings were from graphic designers. I wasn't reading a lot of philosophy, so that was just something that I've recently been doing. So just like, tied into the honors program. But what I got out of it is that designers are very concerned with, the lack of ethics in design and how we're constantly being forced to push these agendas because we want to make money. And I mean, money isn't necessarily an evil, but at a certain point it becomes so. So there's, oh gosh, his name eludes me. I can't recall. There's this great designer. He's the one who created the design for I Love New York. And Paul Rand, that's his name. So he quotes how like you do simple evils as a designer, but those simple evils can slowly accumulate and then become a greater evil. So my example of like the cereal box is a simple evil that he also talks about. I got it from him pretty much, is that, we're creating this packaging for this thing that's not necessarily good for us, but it's not killing us. But then if we go and we design advertising for a vehicle, and we know that the vehicle will not pass any crash course, tests, and that it's going to kill people, essentially, then that is a grand evil. But like as designers, we feel like we're forced to do these things because it's kind of the norm, is that we design without really thinking of the actual outcome. And so I think more designers are aware of this problem now, and they're actually trying to create more ethical design, whether it's the message that they're trying to introduce into society, or the practices of like using recycled products and trying to use less like harmful chemicals in their designs. So I think in the design world, it's definitely something that's being talked about. I didn't see it a lot in my classes, but it was mentioned here and there by like my professors. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, another question for Karen from Mary Sue. How can a designer be more aware of design ethics? You kind of talked about that, but maybe talk about it more directly.
Hi, Mary Sue. All right. How can a designer be? Well, yeah, I did kind of touch on that, but you have to kind of just see where your morals lie and in the society that you're trying to create design for. So some things are ethical to others, and then some things are not. So you just have to be more aware of like what you're creating for. Like, for example, my capstone project is for my major is feminism, and trying to inform the misinformed or the uninformed about what feminism truly is. And so that to me is what I find ethical, something that I want to share with people. So it's kind of like you have to see what society is thinking about on that topic and then try to push kind of your own personal agenda in it, but in a palatable way. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Kesimy. So one of the things you said, which I thought was really interesting, was that books can be mirrors. And I think to an extent, Maria addressed that too. If books are mirrors, and someday, like, okay, this is a bad example because I have very short hair. When I had hair, some days you get up in the morning and your hair is fine, it goes where you want it to go. Other days you wake up in the morning and you look like you got hit by a truck. Okay, so mirrors reflect beauty and ugly, negative and positive aesthetics. So is there a place then for negative representations as maybe as an example of where we were historically in relation to a lack of diversity and acceptance? And is there a place for those kinds of texts as well as a place with text that you were calling for too? So sort of a combination. Come on up here.
Thank you for the question. I think within my discussion on text and a collection of books, I think it's a priority for educators to make sure that they're having the right types of discussions with students. So first and foremost, to have texts that are explicitly positive, and then also to include these older texts or classics, right? But then having the types of discussions that do talk about slavery, that do talk about the good, bad, and the ugly, right? So I think I just want to address that first, is the call for these positive books or books that have characters that are viewed in a positive light, that reflect the beauty of certain students that haven't had that opportunity just yet, or that are just being introduced this opportunity to have a mirror that reflects them in a positive light, is very important. So that's the first part. But then secondly, yes, I do think that it's just as important for educators to have that, to have these books that reflect the true history of America. And I think that comes through textbooks and like having an actual conversation with students about the ugly. Yeah, I like that, the good, bad, and ugly kind of thing. But yeah, I think that those books do have a place in the collection. I don't think it was part of the discussion within my paper, but as a question, just separately, I do think that yes, it's very important to include those and for it not to all be rose colored. I think part of life is finding balance between the good and the bad, and to have both of those, and to not view either part as like, this is bad, we can't talk about this. This is good, we should talk about it, but we should talk about it all in a balanced way and acknowledge that the good and the bad, yin and yang, right? That is reality. Life is the good, bad, and the ugly, and that's just as important to recognize.
Do we have any other questions out there?
I have a
Becky, okay, Becky has a question.
All right, I'm formulating this in my mind, and I think it's kind of for everyone, and I apologize, I missed the first two because I was at another presentation, but my question is based on what I've heard and listening to Maria. I thought it was interesting, that quote, I wrote it down. The heck did I write it down? Writing is like reading is not innocent. And so I guess my question is to kind of flip that a little bit. Writing then is not innocent, and creating is not innocent. And so who gets to do the creating? Like, whose story, if I'm a writer, whose story do I get to tell? If I'm a designer, whose story do I get to represent? I'm just kind of throwing that out to see where it lands, if that makes sense. And anybody, it sounds like I missed the first two, which sound like they were really great. But I guess that's my question is, and if books are mirrors and design is a type of mirror, who gets to show what's being reflected? I'm going to mute myself now.
And actually, Becky, I was thinking of that as Kesemy was just answering my last question in relation to Maria, because you're talking about the creation and also sort of the consumption, writing and reading, but what about the critic? Where does the critic fall in here? Because criticism is definitely not all innocent, and it certainly depends on your perspective. So any and all of those three categories, Maria and anyone else who, after Maria is finished, if you have any thoughts on this, Maria.
Yeah, so I really like that question because that's something I was thinking about as well on the writing side of my projects. Like, okay, so when I'm interacting with books that I'm reading, but as well, if I'm ever producing content that I would like to share with other people, then I need to be aware that I am writing from my very personal, subjective experience of reality. And so I think kind of what Kesemy was talking about, the necessity for diverse representation and voices from all areas, because the thing about myths that I wasn't able to get deeply into is that myths might be either good or bad. It's not necessarily bad just because it is a myth, but the social narratives and the way we work, it would be considered a myth, whether it's good, bad, true, false, whatever. So it's just that I think it is that necessity of needing to hear from both sides so that we have something to compare. Because if we're only hearing, the issue comes when we're only hearing from the voices who might already be the dominant or in power, that we don't realize that, okay, this might not actually be normal the way things are structured. So having other voices and having at least just another myth to compare with the myth that we already have. And I don't really want to say that it becomes a matter of picking and choosing, but I think also what Karen was talking about, where you need to know where your convictions lie and your morals are at, and be able to base from those convictions, but at the same time being willing to, this is something I had in my project that I didn't talk about, at the same time being willing to unlearn. So we spend our lives learning and learning and learning, and we are taught to kind of have these certain perspectives, but at some point there also comes a time when we need to unlearn what we've already learned and realize, oh my gosh, this stuff is happening over here. I'm hearing these people's stories that I've never heard before. This deconstructs some of the ways that I've been viewing society and my place in it. So I think for me, it's just that decision to be, okay, I don't really know at the moment which myths or what I'm reading or what I'm writing, how it might be disempowering some people and might help be empowering myself. So it's just that individual commitment to say, okay, every time I encounter something or read something or write something, I want to be aware of these issues and trying to see more clearly through that and to think critically about it and to have a commitment to trying to hear other voices. I think I went around in circles there. I think I stayed on track with the question. I can't quite remember. Was there any other part, Becky, or did any of you two though? Okay. Okay, yeah.
No, I think it's just always open for discussion about you know, social justice, what that means in regards to creativity.
Yeah, that's something I kind of want to touch on is equality among all populations. I think something Maria mentioned that was great is the opportunity to be able to write. So the types of populations that how do I say this? It's the population that is able to write and be published. That's growing right now, but it is just growing. So all of our books right now are, yeah, they aren't as diverse and as inclusive as they could be. And so I think the answer to your question in short for me is that everybody should be able to write about their perspective. Whether we agree with it or not is not the issue. It's about getting all stories out there, because not only are books mirrors, they're also windows and sliding doors, meaning we can look through this book and find out about a world we never knew, about a perspective that we never knew about, because books function as windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. And actually, Bishop's she has a whole article on it, and I would encourage everyone to look at how literature functions as these things, as these portals for us to learn more or to unlearn and to see new perspectives. Thank you.
Any other questions for our panelists? All right, and if you want to hear more about literature as a portal, you can hear Maria's talk this afternoon, more in relation to children's literature, but I think it applies to literature as a whole in a lot of ways too. And that'll be right here at 1 p.m. Same link and same room for Maria. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Hold on one more. Actually, yeah, Becky wanted Kesimy wanted to know the article you're referring to.
If you want to just type this, or I can type it into the
Yes,
box.
I can type it.
It's called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Doors. And it's written by Redeem Sims Bishop.
Okay. All right. Thank you all very much.
Cameron, can I say something?
Absolutely.
I'd like to thank you for hosting this panel this morning, and I'd like to thank all the presenters. I feel like they've lost something in the experience because we didn't get to thank them all for their work. So I was speaking for myself. I'd like to thank them for all they did. Absolutely.
Let's have a virtual or actual round of applause for all our presenters. All right. All right, thank you all for attending this session, and please do attend one of the or any of the afternoon sessions. You can bounce around on Zoom quite easily. So thank you all very much, and yeah, great job to our presenters. Bye, everybody.